Shabbat Shalom. We're getting to the end of graduation season. Many of us have attended graduations recently for high schools, colleges, or graduate schools. Even my daughter recently received a so-called diploma for her graduation from the infant room at her daycare. I'm not joking. They put an actual graduation cap on this certificate for moving up to the toddler room. I think it's pretty hilarious. But just over 50 years ago, a very particular graduation took place, one that I'd like to honor today. On June 3rd, 1972, Rabbi Sally Priesand became the first female rabbi to be ordained by a rabbinical seminary. And I'd like to take this moment today to honor her and to tell you a little bit about her. Sally Priesand was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and from a young age, she was devoted to Judaism and to Jewish life. She studied at the University of Cincinnati, and upon graduation, immediately enrolled at HUC-JIR. She always wanted to be a rabbi, and when she was still in high school, she wrote to HUC-JIR asking for admission. Or rather for admission information. And interestingly enough, they wrote back to her warning that even if they ordained her, they could not guarantee that she would find a job. While in rabbinical school, Priesand did have a difficult time getting internships. Congregations would refuse to interview her, or they would interview her, but only for the novelty, with no intention of actually hiring her. When she was ordained, she did get a pulpit job at the Stephen Weiss Free Synagogue as first the assistant and then the associate rabbi. She worked there for 7 years, and then she had trouble finding another full-time pulpit. For a while, she worked in part-time chaplaincy work as well as part-time pulpit work until she found the right community for her. She took a job as the rabbi of the Monmouth Reform Temple in Tinton Falls, New Jersey, a congregation of 285 families, where she served for 25 years until her retirement. According to the historian Pamela Nadell, Priesand infused the community's worship services with more Hebrew and congregational singing, and she shared her deep commitments to the needs of the poor, the survival of Israel, and the cause of justice and peace, propelling the congregation to social action. Together, Priesand and her congregants forged a creative partnership, guided by her conviction that a rabbi's primary task is to help Jews take responsibility for their own Judaism. Also, fun fact, she paints. Her watercolors were actually on display at HUC-JIR in 2002. Rabbi Priesand faced many obstacles as the first woman rabbi, and those who came after, myself included, are indebted to her as a trailblazer for helping to change public perception about who can be a rabbi and about who looks rabbinic. Thankfully, we've made it to the point where many communities wouldn't think twice about hiring a rabbi of any gender or sexual orientation, and where the rabbinate reflects much of the diversity of the Jewish people. At the same time, however, Sally Priesand's ordination didn't come out of nowhere. Rather, she was the beneficiary of many generations of women who pushed the limits on who could take on what types of leadership roles in Jewish communities. Some of their stories are told in a fascinating book called Women Who Would Be Rabbis by Pamela Nadell. And I would like to share pieces of the stories from that book with you today, as well as an additional story. I'd like to share these stories because, first of all, I find them fascinating. And I think these other women deserve to be honored. And also because I think that these stories tell us something about the nature of change. Sally Priesand was not the first woman to be ordained as a rabbi. She was the first to be ordained by a rabbinical school, but she was not the first woman to be ordained. Some of us may have heard of Regina Jonas, who became the first woman ordained as a rabbi in 1935 in Germany, and she was murdered in Auschwitz. Jonas studied at a rabbinical school in Berlin, and her graduate thesis was titled, "May a Woman Hold Rabbinic Office?" On the opening page of her thesis, she writes, "I personally love this profession, and if ever possible, I also want to practice it." On the last page, she concludes, "Almost nothing halachically but prejudice and lack of familiarity stand against women holding rabbinic office." Later, she wrote, "If I confess what motivated me, a woman, to become a rabbi, two things come to mind: my belief in God's calling and my love of humans. God planted in our heart skills and a vocation without asking about gender. Therefore, it is the duty of men and women alike to work and create according to the skills given by God." Her teachers praised her thesis, but instead of ordination, they granted her a teaching degree. In fact, her thesis advisor had been in charge of granting ordination at the school, but sadly, he died before he could grant it to her, and his predecessor was less open to change. 11 years after her graduation, Rabbi Max Dieneman, the executive director of the Conference of Liberal Rabbis, gave her private ordination. She worked as a chaplain at the Jewish hospital, and she preached at some of the liberal synagogues in Berlin. When Jews started to flee Germany, Jonas made the choice to stay, to support those who could not leave, including her mother. She continued to teach and to provide pastoral support, even when she was sent to do forced labor in a factory and even into Eisenstadt. Her fellow prisoners found comfort in her words and her support. Part of the tragedy of Regina Jonas's life is that because she was killed in Auschwitz, she never became well known in the larger Jewish world. It really took a long time before she was rediscovered, as it were. Women who came after her, who felt called to the rabbinate, never knew that she had already done what they were fighting for the right to do. Now, while Jonas may have been the first woman to be ordained, she was not the first woman to study at a rabbinical school. A number of women studied at both the Reform movement's HUCJIR and at the conservative movement's Jewish Theological Seminary decades prior to Presand's ordination. As early as 1903, Henrietta Zold, who many of us know for her work founding Hadassah and for her involvement with Youth Aliyah and JPS and so many other Jewish organizations, she became the first woman to take rabbinical courses at JTS, promising when she applied not to seek ordination. And she actually supposedly was taking these classes so that she could publish her father's unpublished works that he had written before he died. And she said she felt that she needed additional training in order to be able to do that. Several other women followed suit over the decades, pursuing rabbinical studies, but without a degree at the end of it, or rather without the rabbinical ordination at the end of it. There were also earlier women who served in a rabbinical capacity without rabbinic credentials. For example, Paula Ackerman, an educated Jew and an excellent teacher, was married to a rabbi, and for many years she served in what some might call the traditional Rebbitzin role, teaching and supporting the congregation in many ways. When her husband died in 1950, the congregation invited her to take over and serve as a sort of interim rabbi. She served in that role for 3 years. And that wasn't all. Years later, she served as a spiritual leader yet again, this time for her childhood congregation. Perhaps the most surprising story is the story of Ray Frank, who preached in many congregations as a visiting teacher as far back as the 1890s. She was so popular and charismatic that she was a highly sought after speaker, and she was referred to in the press as the girl rabbi of the Golden West. She had chutzpah. I have to tell you about the first time she preached. She was working as a correspondent for some local newspapers, and her work brought her to Spokane, Washington, on the eve of the high holidays. She discovered that there were no services being held, so she reached out to a member of the Jewish community. He agreed to arrange for the services to take place as long as she would preach. She did, and she used the opportunity to chastise the community for not having a synagogue. These women and many more broke people's expectations of what women could or should do. They created new possibilities, not only for themselves, but for those who came after them. Their courage helped create a world where it is commonplace for people of all genders to take on all sorts of leadership roles in our communities. It's appropriate to honor these women today when we read Parashat Shlach Lecha, a parsha that in many ways is all about leadership. In our parsha, there are 12 people in positions of leadership, each representing their tribe. 2 of them prove worthy of their positions, using their influences to try to share a message of hope and inspiration. When there are people who have an important message to share, it's so important to make sure that they have a platform to share that message. Now, each of these women was a product of her time. Each held beliefs about women's roles that today might be considered conservative. Henrietta Zolds claimed to think that it was better for women to not become rabbis, and she was comfortable acquiring the knowledge and the training without taking on a rabbinic role. Ray Frank spoke in glowing terms of the importance for Jewish women of embracing the role of motherhood, and she pursued her career only as long as she was single, stopping when she got married. Our ideas about gender have changed a lot over time, but each of these women made strides towards giving women a greater voice and greater influence in our society. They moved us closer to equality for all. Even today, as we know, equal respect and rights for people of all genders continues to remain elusive and unstable. At this time, when some of us may feel that our rights are under attack, let us draw courage from these brave women who dared to create new roles for women and to serve as role models for those to come. Let's not take their progress for granted, but let's recognize how precious these gains have been for Jews of all genders who benefited from what they and those came after them have to offer our society. We've all benefited from what they've had to teach and what they've had to contribute. I opened by noting that this is graduation season. Graduations are a time to celebrate, to remember, to cherish what we have accomplished, and to look ahead to what comes next. Let's take this moment to celebrate how far we've come and to commit to keep moving forward. Let us be inspired by all the trailblazers who helped us reach this day, and let us remain committed to a vision of equality and respect for all. Shabbat Shalom.